The doors are out of the clamps and now we're ready to move on and install the hinges. We're going to be using the Brusco ST18 brass hinges, and they can be a little tricky to install, but with a shim it's a whole lot easier and it makes it consistent on every corner. So let's go ahead and get those installed. We're going to install the part of the hinge that has the barrel in the top and the bottom panel, not the doors themselves. And to begin, I've got a scrap piece of cut off from the door, so I know it's the same exact thickness. And I've scribed a center line on that piece. And we're going to be using a playing card or a business card as a shim just to give us a little bit of wiggle room. But the first thing we're going to do is take the hinge, lay it down and flush it up against the angle on the side walls, and then take a straight edge and line it up with the inside of the barrel, making it flush with the outside of the wall. So just bring the straight edge over until it just becomes flush with the inside of that barrel with the outside of the wall. And so then just take your pencil and make a reference mark. And this is going to let us know how far in to mortise for the hinge. Next, we're going to take our scrap block with the center line and the shim and place it against the wall again at the same angle and bring it over to that line that we just drew. And we're going to bring that center line down. And so what that gives us is a stop mark and a center line for our hinge. Now, to make this a whole lot easier to lay out the hinge, let's figure out the distance from this backside edge of the hinge to the edge of the side panel. And that way, if we create a shim, we can just easily line the shim up and then butt the hinge up against it and get consistent results instead of having to do these several markings every time. So we know this hinge is 3/8 of an inch. And so that means that to the left and to the right of this center line is going to be 3/16 of an inch. So just take a ruler and make a line 3/16, and then bring your hinge back up to confirm, and that's what we have. So now if we can figure out how much of a shim we need from this little 3/16 mark to the edge of our side panel, we can create a shim to that thickness. And what I have here is a piece of thin plywood that is roughly 1/4 of an inch, and it lines up with that line just perfect. And now I say 1/4 of an inch, but plywood is never really 1/4 of an inch unless you get Baltic birch or some specialty plywood. This is just your basic Home Depot plywood, so it's actually a little bit under 1/4 of an inch. And mine just happened to fit that just perfect, and it lines up with that line. So now all I've got to do is take the hinge, place it up against that shim, and it fits just perfect. Now that we have our shim, I'm just going to take a piece of double-sided tape and put it on the bottom. And this is just going to hold it into place so I can scribe around it. And then going back to the shim, I'm going to line it up with that first line that we made and then press it into place. And as you can see, that center line is still the center of the hinge, and that double-sided tape is going to hold it into place so that I can scribe around it. And to also play it safe, I'm going to mark around it with my pencil so that when I remove it, I can still see it. And that's the position of our hinge. Now it's just a matter of hogging out that waste. And now that we have our shim, all we have to do is come to the other side of the cabinet, line up the barrel, make sure that it's flush, draw a line, use our shim, bring up the hinge to our line, and that's the location. Scribe around it and then move on to the next corner. To route the mortise, I've got the cabinet disassembled and I've got the top panel clamped to my assembly table. I've got a 3/16 of an inch straight bit installed in my router, and I've got the height of the bit set to the thickness of the hinge. And all I'm going to do is just slowly take my time, freehand, and remove the majority of the waste, staying away from the line that I will then clean up using my chisel. And this is where having that scribe line comes in handy, because we can slowly work our way back to that scribe line and then set our chisel in that scribe line to get an exact fit. I've got the case partially assembled, and we're going to go ahead and install all of the screws on the hinges. And the reason we're doing that is so that we can now hang the doors. When you're installing the hinges, you want to make sure to pre-drill the holes and then cut the threads with the steel screw before installing the brass screw, because obviously the brass is really soft and we don't want those to break off inside of the hinges, especially now. So I've got a self-centering countersink bit that I'm going to be using on the holes, and then following that up with a steel screw. And now I'm just going to use a screwdriver and cut the threads with the steel screw. Now I can switch over and install the brass screw. I've got the doors out of the clamps, and before I hang the doors, I'd like to go ahead and glue up the cabinet. And I would also like to go ahead and put a rabbet on the back side of the cabinet and install the back panel. And what that's going to do is it's going to square this cabinet up, and it's not going to give it any lateral movement. If we were to install the doors now without the back panel, the cabinet isn't exactly solid and it's going to shift left to right. So what could be a perfect reveal and a perfect fit now could change when we glue the cabinet up. With the random orbit sander, I start with 80, 120, 150, and then stop at 180 grit. And now that I have everything sanded, I'm going to use my block plane set to a really fine setting to hit all of the edges. So you've assembled and disassembled this several times, so you should be pretty familiar with how this goes together. What I'm going to do is put glue on the tapered sliding dovetail, the tenon portions, and slide it into the dovetails on the top and the bottom, lay it on its back, and then reference my assembly table when tapping the top and the bottom down until it's nice and flush. So make sure you have your glue, your wet paper towels for any squeeze out, and of course your mallet, and everything should go to plan, and it should be pretty uneventful. So here we go. It's always nerve-wracking whenever it comes time to gluing this up after you put so much work into it. But with enough planning, hopefully everything will come out. And no matter how many projects you do, you'll always have that feeling of, what am I forgetting? Make sure you have plenty of glue. And like I was saying, I've already got some squeeze out. That's why I got the wet paper towel. And then I'm going to wipe off that glue squeeze out before I put it together. And so I marked the taper sliding dovetail. This is the left wall outer face. So facing the front of the cabinet, this is the left side. And I'm just going to get this started. And actually the glue helped slide it in a little bit. And again, look at my markings. Here's the right out face. So again, put glue on the tenon. And the good thing about tapered sliding dovetails is you can at least get started before it starts to get hard. And you're obviously going to get a lot of squeeze out on the back. So let's go ahead and take care of that. And this is where I'm going to lay it on its back. And when the bottom of the panels, the top and bottom panels are flush with the assembly table, I know that everything is nice and flush in the back. Now check the top and the bottom. It's flush, flat with the assembly table. Now we can set it up and pretty much leave it the way it is and dry. Now we're going to go ahead and cut the rabbet on the back of the case. I've got the case laying on its back on the router table, and I've got a bearing guided rabbeting bit installed. And I've got it set up to make a 3/8 of an inch cut. And I'm going to continue to raise the bit until I get to 3/4 of an inch in depth, 1/4 of an inch at a time. I'm just going to slowly work around on the inside of the case, removing the waste, and then I'll raise the bit 1/4 of an inch and keep going until it's 3/4 of an inch in depth. This is something that you want to take nice and slow, and make sure you have plenty of room around your router table. And next I raise the bit 1/4 of an inch and make another pass. I do this one more time, giving us a total of 3 passes. The rabbeting bit left rounded corners, and we're going to go ahead and square that up. I'm going to use a marking knife and a marking gauge first to give me a nice scribe line, and then I'm going to use a chisel to remove the waste. So to begin, I've got the marking gauge set so that it's the thickness of this wall, and I'm just going to scribe a line right into where I think this other line's going to come. But again, this is the back side of the cabinet, so it doesn't have to be perfect. And then I'm going to take a combination square, line this edge of it up with the inside of the rabbet, and just scribe a line with the grain, and that's going to show me the waste that I need to remove. I'm going to be using a 3/4 inch chisel to first deepen the scribe lines, just so it's a little bit easier when it comes time to remove the final bit of waste. So just a light tap. Now, majority of the waste that we're having to remove is from this sidewall. So what I'm going to do is go perpendicular to the grain of the sidewall to remove a majority of the waste. This is going to help prevent any cracking or any splitting of the sidewall, since we only have like a 3/8 of an inch thick sidewall. And I'm going to stay about a 1/16 of an inch away from the scribe line and just keep removing the waste, moving the chisel down a little bit at a time. And now we've got a little bit of waste left parallel to the grain and also parallel to the grain on the bottom panel. So what I'm going to do is take the chisel, stick it in the scribe line, and I'm actually going to tilt the chisel forward about 1 degree or 2 and then remove the waste. And a majority of the waste is removed, and now I'm going to switch to a 1/4 inch chisel and clean it up. Now I'm going to measure the case to get the dimensions of the back panel. I measure in 3 spots on the width as well as the height of the panel to make sure that it's going to be the right size. Since I'm veneering the back panel, I'm using 1/4 inch MDF. So over at the table saw, I cut it to width and length. We're ready to go ahead and hang the doors, and this is going to be a lot of trial and error because we've got to fit it in a couple different ways. We've got to fit it in between the top and the bottom washer on these hinges, and we've also got to get it to fit just perfect once we cut the angles on the doors. So to begin, I'm going to make sure that the door vertically fits between the top and the bottom washer. I'm going to take a few swipes with my block plane, see if I can get it to fit. And after a few passes with the block plane, it's pretty good. I'm happy with that, so I'm going to move on to the other door and get it to fit the same way. And my goal is to get the other door, the reveal, to match this reveal exactly, so that way it has an even gap all the way across the cabinet. We're going to go ahead and cut the angles on the doors. It's extremely important to reference the plans when it comes time to marking the doors, and you want to put the reference marks on the doors in the correct way so that there's no guessing when it comes time to cutting them at the table saw. So reference the guide or the plans and determine which way you need to remove the waste off of the doors. And then make a few reference marks on the top of the doors and on the bottom, so that when you get to the table saw, you may need to flip a door in order to line it up with the blade. So pay close attention to the plans when you're marking your doors. And what I like to do is put the doors together. This is the right door, this is the left door, and I'm just holding them together. And this is going to make it a lot easier when it comes time to putting a few reference marks, so that I know when I'm looking down, referencing the plan the same way, that the right door is going to have a groove like, or a cut like that, and this other door, the left door, is going to have a cut like that. And you'll notice that again they come to a point which matches the plans. And on the left door on the left side, you're going to draw a reference line so it removes the waste like that, and on the right door you're going to draw the reference line like that. You're pretty much always on the outside of the doors drawing a reference line so that it goes from the inside corner to the outside face. Now to set the fence, I'm going to slowly nibble away until it removes the waste, and it just touches the top edge so that I'm not removing anything off of the width of the door. It's just going to remove and cut the 83-degree angle on the side. And again, before I make the cut, make sure you have your line lined up the same way. I mean, if it removes a little bit off of the width, that's fine, because remember, we made these a little wide, so it's not that big of a deal, but don't remove too much, obviously. And then, so I'm going to set that to the right side of my fence, and then I'm going to grab the other door, look at it, make sure it's lined up the same way, look at my marks. So that way I can just grab them and cut them without having to guess while the saw is running. And now I should be able to just flip these over to cut the other edge without moving the fence. And it should give me the same exact cut, not removing anything off of the width. So again, line your marks up and then make the cut. I got the doors in place and they're just a little too wide, but I'm not going to touch anything until I get the hinges installed. And then all I'm going to do is use a hand plane to get this to be a perfect fit. It's probably just a little too wide by maybe a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch. So I'm not going to touch that at all, and I'm just going to use my block plane to make it a perfect fit. They fit just perfect between the two barrels, and they fit between the two washers just fine. So we're in a good spot right here. Do not take off too much at the table saw. So now let's go ahead and set this up so we can get the hinges installed on the doors. To transfer the location of the hinges from the case to the doors, I've removed the hinges from the case. So I'm going to take the door and make sure that the door is flush against this angle that we cut on the side wall. And remember that playing card we use as a shim for the hinges on the case, I'm going to put that behind the door, and that's going to shim the door out a little bit just to give it some breathing room. And then all I'm going to do now is transfer the mortise location from the bottom of the case to the bottom of the door, just using a marking knife. I find it a little bit easier to flip the case over to mark the top of the door, because there's a little gap that we have because of the washers that we had to account for. So it's easier to flip the case upside down to mark for the top of the door. And I've already got one of the doors installed. So in case you're looking at that and wondering. So don't forget to flip the door over, take your playing card, and to put it into place. I got some double-sided tape on the hinge to help me stick this down so I can outline it. And to line it up, remember how on the barrel portion of the bottom of the hinge we had on the outside of the case? We're going to do the same thing on the door. Make sure that that's the inside edge is flush with the edge of the door. And then I'm going to take a combination square and set it to the distance from the side of the door to the back of the hinge, because I have the hinge lined up with the tick marks that I made with my marking knife. And I'm going to transfer that to the front. I'm going to push down to activate the tape. And I'm just going to take a pencil real quick and mark around it, just in case it moves, I can line it back up. And then very carefully, I'm going to take a marking knife and scribe around it, so that when I remove the waste, I can use a chisel and put it right in that scribe line. To hog out the majority of the waste, I'm using my trim router with that same 3/16 of an inch straight bit. I just take my time and stay about 1/8 of an inch away from the line. To remove the rest of the waste, I use a 1/4 inch and a 3/4 inch chisel. I remove a majority of the waste, leaving about 1/16 of an inch before I then put the chisel in the scribe line to do the final cut. And I'm going to take this opportunity to go ahead and pre-drill and install the screws. And I'm pretty much just going to repeat the same thing on the other side. Now we can go ahead and put the door on, and to install the hinges, it's rather simple. Leave the hinge installed on the bottom of the door, slide it into place on the barrel, and then take the other hinge and slide it over the barrel. And then it's kind of tricky, but just slide it in the mortise on the top of the door. And I'm just going to install one screw for the time being to see how the door fits. With the door installed, now we can go ahead and close it, and notice that the doors are just a little too big. They're already touching on the inside. And you can also look at the bottom of the case and see that the reveal is not quite the same. There's more reveal over on this side than there is in the center, so we know the doors need to go in a little bit more. So all I'm going to do is use a hand plane, probably my block plane again, remove the same amount off of both doors on the inside. And what I'm also going to do is take a pencil and scribe the outside of the door where it meets the case, because it's overlapped here a little bit as well. So I'll just use the block plane, remove that until it's flush with the outside of the case, and then get the insides of the doors to close. When they're closed, the reveal is the same as well. Now, I'm not going to lie and say that this was a quick process, because you have to put it back on the hinges, test it, take it back off, and keep removing waste. It ended up taking about 20 minutes, but the doors ended up fitting just perfect with the right amount of reveal at the top and the bottom.